Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and today we're discussing protests sweeping Iran following the death of a young woman. Masha Amini was a young woman taken into custody by the Iranian regime's so-called morality police. Her offense? Allegedly improperly wearing her headscarf or hijab, which is mandatory by law. Masha Amini was a healthy young woman when she went into custody. Other women in the detention center say they saw her being brutally beaten by police while in custody. The horrified public, led by women, has responded with protests. These protests are calling not merely for an end to the mandatory hijab law, but for wholesale regime change. The regime has responded by cracking down on protesters, killing many more, and this has led, in turn, to sanctions against the Iranian government by other countries, including Canada. What do these sanctions mean? And what more do we need to know about the protests? And how can Canadians help? Here today to discuss this are two experts, Kaveh Shahrooz and Shaparak Shajarizadeh. Thank you both so much for joining me today. Shaparak, let's start with you. What more do we need to know about the background of the protests and what is going on in Iran?
Hello, thank you for inviting me, Christian. It's been over 4 decades that Iranian people have been suppressed, especially Iranian women. Iranian women lost many rights after the revolution in 1979. And apart from that, they have been facing violence every day in the streets, systematic violence by the government, by their so-called morality police, or even so people who are sympathetic with the leader, the leader's supporter. So the fear of being attacked in the streets is like a shadow on our shoulder every day when we go out. They want Iranian women to have a specific dress code. But as you see, during these years, Iranian women push back their boundaries, and because this is not our culture, not many people believe in hijab, and many Iranian women are educated, and they want a life of a woman in like other countries, like democratic countries, and other from that suppression of the other ethnic, suppression of other religion, suppression of LGBTQ community altogether.
Kaveh, is there anything that you want to add to the background of the death of this young woman at the hands of the morality police, or about the mandatory hijab law and its history in Iran?
Not much beyond what Shaparak has said. I will say that the mandatory hijab laws and the morality police, these are parts of the daily indignities that Iranian women have to deal with. Iranian women under the law, like this is not interpretation of the law. This is literally the law. They are considered worth half of men. Their testimony is worth half of men. We live, or Iranians live with a regime that devalues them daily. And it's important to remember that Iranian women have actually been at the forefront of fighting this regime from day one. So in 1979, 1980, when the regime introduced this mandatory hijab law, women were the ones that went out, tens of thousands of them, in the street. They were met with batons. They had acid thrown in their faces, and they continued to fight. And I'm glad that they're leading the charge now.
It's incredible that people who have been most victimized by the regime are the ones leading the charge against it when the consequences to them can be so great. Shaparak, what can you tell me about some of those consequences? What has the regime done to respond to these protests? We've got about a minute.
They usually arrest women. They behave badly. They're so brutal. But these days, during the protests, as you see, they're killing not just women. They're killing teenagers. They are beating up teenagers to death, and that's devastating to see the news, to see their videos, how alive and happy they wanted to be, and now they're dead for freedom, for demanding freedom.
Kaveh, we've got 10 seconds. Is there an estimate on how many people have been killed in these protests?
The official number that I've heard is about 150, but that's almost certainly an underestimate. It's going to be a multiple of that once the facts are fully revealed.
We've got to go to commercial break, but we will be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice. We are discussing the protests sweeping Iran and Canada's new sanctions against that government. So, Kaveh, the Canadian government has announced new sanctions against Iran. What do those include, and how are they different from the pre-existing sanctions? Because there have been sanctions against Iran for a long time.
There have been sanctions against Iran for a number of years. This one just expands the list of sanctioned people and entities. So now there are some leading generals and leading figures in the Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is a very feared and violent arm of the Iranian regime. Some of those figures are listed as sanctioned, and them and their families, and also some entities related to the IRGC, and also Press TV, which is Iran's English language sort of propaganda channel. This isn't quite what the activists have been pushing for. We had wanted the IRGC in its entirety, not just sanctioned, but also listed as a terror group. We haven't gotten there yet, but I think this is a pretty good start for Canada.
Kaveh, are there any countries that have listed the IRGC as a terror group or sanctioned that organization itself?
Yeah, the Trump administration actually listed the IRGC as a terror group, and they were told, the sky would fall if they designated them as a terrorist organization, and nothing has happened. Iran basically had to accept that designation. We've been pushing Canada to do the same. I don't quite understand the reluctance on the part of our elected officials, but hopefully they'll change their mind.
Shaparak, as we said, there have been existing sanctions against the regime. These new ones expand the list, but do you think that will have much impact that will be any different from the pre-existing sanctions? Do you think that the regime is going to listen to what Canada does?
Unfortunately, I don't think that's enough. That's not what Iranian activists want, and also the families of the victim of flight PS 752, who had lost their family members, their loved ones, by the IRGC. That's not what they want. This is not quite enough, unfortunately.
So you mentioned this flight that was shot down by Iran, which included, I think it was 50 Canadians and 30 permanent residents. Kaveh, we haven't talked about this on the show yet, but I think that's important background to understand. What can you tell us about that? What happened in that case?
So what happened was one night, this was after the Trump administration had killed Qasem Soleimani, one of the IRGC generals. Iran, even though it knew that there was some conflict predicted, it kept its airspace open and allowed a few commercial flights to fly. Our theory, I'm somebody that helps and advises the families. Our theory is that they were put up there basically as human shields, and the IRGC shot 2 missiles at this plane, killing 176 people. Since then, the families.
This was a civilian passenger plane.
Civilian, yeah. None of these people had anything to do with the conflict. They were not political. They were just like you and I, getting on an airplane, going on a trip. The flight was supposed to go from Tehran to Kiev, and a lot of those people were then headed from Kiev to Toronto or Montreal or elsewhere. Iran has initially denied that it was responsible, and then eventually Western intelligence exposed them. They have hidden the black box. They raised the ground where it, they basically have stood in the way of an investigation every single step of the way. And we're continuously pushing for the IRGC that was responsible for this to be listed as a terror group for this one action alone. I mean, it's committed hundreds of other crimes, but this action alone should deem it to be a terror organization.
Shaparak, how has the Canadian government responded to what happened on that flight? What have they done for the families of the people who were killed by the Iranian regime?
They have been supporting, but at the same time they act weakly. They haven't done anything. They just it's just I'm so sorry. It's just words and sympathy, but nothing more than that so far.
Kaveh, anything you want to add in about 40 seconds to what Canada
Sure.
has done for these families?
I mean, they've paid a lot of rhetorical lip service. They've engaged in some negotiation with Iran, but those negotiations have broken down. The time has now come to refer this matter to the International Civil Aviation Organization, which can be the path to the International Court of Justice. And the time has come for Canada to support the families as they take this case to the International Criminal Court. And Canada hasn't done those things, unfortunately.
Yeah, and the International Civil Aviation Organization, I think, is actually based in
Based
Montreal.
on Montreal,
Yeah,
correct? Yes.
so it's surprising that our government hasn't done more related to the death of so many Canadians and Canadian residents. We've got to go to commercial break, but we will be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we were discussing the protests sweeping Iran and the new sanctions imposed by the Canadian government on Iran. Now, Kaveh, how do the sanctions imposed by Canada on Iran differ from sanctions that have been imposed on other countries? For example, there are recent expanded sanctions on Russia. There have been sanctions on Belarus. Are these sanctions sort of stricter? Are they less strict? Are they about the same? How would they compare?
Yeah, I'll give you my answer with the caveat that I'm not a sanctions lawyer, so there might be intricacies that I don't know. The sanctions are similar in style, but I think what has happened with Russia sanctions, which I hope will happen with Iran as well, is that the sanctions have been extended to oligarchs. So people that are not military figures, not even necessarily government figures, but they have ties to the Putin regime and they have, they're kleptocrats. This has not happened with Iran. Everyone that was recently listed by Canada is tied to the IRGC somehow. But really, that's not enough. There are lots of people outside the military establishment in Iran who have stolen money, who have engaged in human rights abuses, and they can still walk free. And I think that's it's an important loophole that the Canadian government ought to be closing.
Yeah, Shaparak, I want to ask you about that because I think we all know that after Putin invaded Ukraine, there were a lot of oligarchs and their families who had these sanctions imposed against them, people associated with the Russian government, maybe in a more commercial sense. Do you think, are there a lot of Iranian regime affiliated people living in Canada right now? And do you think that if they and their families live here, is there a possibility that sanctions could be imposed against them? And should they be?
Yeah, there are lots of people that we know they are affiliated with the regime, and also some of them are publicly like defending the regime in Canada, unfortunately, and it's so hard, to see and watch them and not able to do anything about it, and it's really sad and also a little bit scary, and we are hopeful that the Canadian government do something about it.
Yeah, that it is scary because we know that the Iranian regime has targeted human rights activists operating outside of Iran. So the idea that there are regime-affiliated people in this country is really frightening, actually. Kaveh, anything you want to add to that?
No, I think that's exactly right. Just in the last few months, we've had reports. The FBI has exposed plots by Iran to kidnap human rights activists. Very well-known women's rights activists. And Iran has a long history of carrying out assassinations abroad. For years, I and many others who are involved in this issue have been sort of screaming and trying to talk to Canadian officials to tell them to take this issue seriously. They have not. In the last few days, I'm happy to say that there's been lots more media interest, political interest. I hope that doesn't fade, and I hope that we bring the power of our state to bear and kick these people out and close the door to other regime officials coming into the country.
Shaparak, I think part of the interest is because there have been these huge protests, not just in Iran, but in Canada as well. And I believe you and Kaveh both attended one of these protests recently in Richmond Hill, which was enormous. What can you tell me about what that protest was like?
My God, I cannot describe. I don't have any word to describe it because I'm here like 4 years and I've been attending like most of the gatherings in here, and I was waiting for other Iranians to come and join us. but this time, seeing like the crowd, so many people at the same time supporting their brothers and sisters in Iran, and also like demanding the same thing from the Canadian government. Also, Kaveh was had an important role in that gathering, and it was amazing for me. It was a dream come true, and believe it has a great impact on Iranian people and also the Iranian government. The leader actually talked about the event in Toronto, and also more than 160 other cities around the world. That was amazing, and it gave Iranian inside Iran hope. They've been telling me, you have no idea how grateful we are that we have your support out of Iran.
That's amazing. I'm so happy to hear that it's getting attention in Iran, the size and scale of these protests in Canada. We've got to go to break, but we will be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we are discussing sanctions on the Iranian government following widespread protests in that country. One of the things that is so incredible about these protests, Kaveh, is that these protests are not just about an end to the mandatory hijab law, although that is certainly part of it. These protests are about wholesale regime change. What can you tell me about that, and how this protest might be different from previous protests, which have also called for regime change, notably, I think, the 2009 Green Revolution?
Well, the 2009 one actually did not immediately call for regime change. It was based on, a flawed election, a stolen election. And there, I think the underlying premise was that somehow the system maybe could be fixed a little bit. No one has that assumption anymore. The idea, as you hear it very loud and clear on the streets. People aren't even talking about mandatory hijab. I mean, they're obviously rejecting that, but the slogan is, death to the dictator, death to the Islamic Republic. And it's so good to hear that so loud and clear, because for so long, Western politicians have been telling us activists that no, actually what Iranian people want is a softer, gentler, sort of cuddlier version of the Islamic Republic. And we have been trying to convince them otherwise. Now, I don't think anyone can possibly deny that. Next time you see a Western politician try to make that argument, I think they will just be laughed off the stage, because all you need to do is show them any clip of these protests that are happening, and the people's demand is pretty blatant and obvious.
Shaparak, what do you want to add to that? How this call for regime change is so different?
Kaveh was right. I was on the streets during 2009 protests. Back then, I was involved in those, and we had some hope in some kind of reform, but it's long gone for Iranian to have any hope in any kind of reforms. I was actually a part of a movement protesting against compulsory hijab. For me, like having all my sisters in the streets unveiled was a dream, and now I see them in the streets, not just unveiled, burning the symbol of suppression, the symbol of their ideology in the streets, burning their scarf, because the Islamic regime has been writing their ideology on women's body, and this is the hijab has been the pillar of the regime. So not having hijab, it means no Islamic Republic, and they know that. And also, as Kaveh said, along with the slogan "Women, Life, Freedom," they are chanting "Death to the dictator." That's what Iranian people want for a few years, actually, since 2017.
Kaveh, what exactly do you think regime change would look like?
That's a great question. So it will look, to set people's minds at ease, it will look very different than what happened in Iraq, right? In Iraq, it was foreign-led regime change. in a country that had no civil society, really. Iraq in 2003 had just had their civil society decimated. Iran is not like that. First of all, this is entirely homegrown. It's being led by Iranian people, Iranian women in particular. And Iran, for all its problems, actually has fairly robust civil society, women's rights groups, environmental groups, and so on. And a lot of Iranians that live abroad that have had the experience of living with democracy in the West now for many years. Obviously, the people inside the country are going to take the lead, and we on the outside are going to follow, and we're going to support them. But I think what will come as a result of this, I can't say the exact shape, but I think will be, once this regime is toppled, it will be far more democratic, far more focused on women's rights, and far more oriented towards the West and towards countries that are free, that we want to be allies with.
Shaparak, we've got about 30 seconds. What can Canadians do to help?
Canadian support Iranian people. Don't listen to their apologies, and demand Canada to do something about IRGC, and don't let the regime get away with murder and human rights violation.
That's all the time we have. I want to thank you both so much.
Thank you, Christine.
We've heard today about the protests sweeping Iran and calls for regime change. The Iranian government is responsible for many atrocities. Some have been against citizens of Canada, like the victims of Flight 752. But the greatest victims of the regime are the citizens of Iran themselves. How can we, as Canadians, support their fight against authoritarianism? You be the judge. Thanks for watching, and remember, a freer Canada starts with you.